Strategist V. Halen Corsa had spent 31 years studying the first 90 before he ever watched it fail. And in all those years, across the formal archives of 600 documented engagements stretching back to the Doctrine's founding, he had never once encountered a single recorded instance in which the Osirian Compact's foundational military principle had not determined the outcome of a war within the opening minute and a half of first contact. He had written 2 books on the subject. He had lectured at the Compact's Senior War College for over a decade. He had been selected, on the strength of that scholarship, to serve as the official campaign historian embedded aboard Grand Marshal Kalen Thurash's flagship for the invasion of the human border system known, in the Compact's own survey records, as Designation Meridian. And he had boarded that flagship with the settled, comfortable confidence of a scholar, about to document the 601st confirmation of a principle he had spent his entire career proving correct. Strategist V. Halen Corsa had spent 31 years studying the first 90 before he ever watched it fail. And in all those years, across the formal archives of 600 documented engagements stretching back to the Doctrine's founding, he had never once encountered a single recorded instance in which the Osirian Compact's foundational military principle had not determined the outcome of a war within the opening minute and a half of first contact. He had written 2 books on the subject. He had lectured at the Compact's Senior War College for over a decade. He had been selected, on the strength of that scholarship, to serve as the official campaign historian embedded aboard Grand Marshal Kalen Thurash's flagship for the invasion of the human border system known, in the Compact's own survey records, as Designation Meridian. And he had boarded that flagship with the settled, comfortable confidence of a scholar, about to document the 601st confirmation of a principle he had spent his entire career proving correct. His own scholarly path into the Doctrine had begun, as he would occasionally recount to junior researchers across the years of his subsequent career, with a childhood spent in a modest household whose walls carried, alongside the ordinary domestic clutter of compact family life, an elaborate hand-drawn genealogical chart tracing his own family's minor but genuine connection through a distant maternal line to the officer corps that had served under Kel Thurash during the campaign that first produced the Doctrine's founding insight. That connection had never carried any formal significance within compact society, too distant and too diffuse to grant Corsa any particular institutional standing, but it had shaped, in the particular way childhood fascinations sometimes do, the entire direction of his subsequent scholarly life, drawing him first toward military history broadly, and then, with increasing and eventually exclusive focus, toward the specific, elegant mathematics of the first 90 itself. A body of theory he had come to regard, across 3 decades of increasingly specialized research, as perhaps the single most complete and rigorously validated principle in the whole of compact military science. That rigor was not, Corsa would have insisted to any colleague who questioned it before the Meridian campaign, mere institutional reverence dressed in scholarly language. He had personally reviewed the full engagement records of all 600 documented campaigns in which the Doctrine had been formally tested, cataloging variables across adversary technology level, fleet composition, engagement geometry, and dozens of other factors his own published methodology had painstakingly controlled for. And in every single documented case, without exception significant enough to require even a footnoted caveat, the pattern had held. He had come to regard that consistency not as coincidence, but as something considerably closer to a genuine law of military psychology, as reliable, in its own domain, as any principle in the compact's considerable body of physical science. It was this settled, thoroughly earned confidence that he carried with him into the fleet's approach toward Meridian's outer system. And it was this same confidence that would, within the span of a single 90-second engagement window, require the most complete revision his own scholarly career had ever undertaken. The doctrine itself was, in its formal articulation, deceptively simple, though Corsa's own published work had spent considerable pages unpacking the 6 centuries of accumulated military theory underlying its brief formal statement. Any sustained conflict, the doctrine held, was decided psychologically within its opening engagement, and that psychological decision occurred without meaningful exception across the whole of recorded compact military history within the first 90 seconds of direct combat contact. Whichever force delivered the more devastating opening blow within that narrow window did not merely gain a tactical advantage. It fundamentally reshaped the adversary's own understanding of what the conflict's eventual outcome would be, an understanding that, once formed in those critical 90 seconds, proved remarkably resistant to any subsequent battlefield reversal. Species that absorbed a sufficiently overwhelming first strike surrendered, on average across 600 documented engagements, within 11 days of that opening contact, regardless of whatever material resources they retained to continue fighting. Species that delivered the first strike themselves, by the same overwhelming statistical pattern, went on to win the broader conflict in the considerable majority of cases, a correlation so consistent across 6 centuries of compact expansion that Assyrian military doctrine had, by the era of Corsa's own service, elevated the first 90 from a useful tactical observation into something considerably closer to a founding article of military faith. Grand Marshal Thurash carried a particular, personal relationship to that doctrine that Corsa understood from his own scholarly research into the man's family history, extended considerably beyond the ordinary institutional loyalty any senior compact officer might reasonably feel toward the principle that had built their entire military tradition. Thurash's own ancestor, a strategist named Kel Thurash, whose name appeared in Corsa's own published scholarship more often than any other single figure across the doctrine's 6th-century history, had been the officer credited with first formally articulating the first 90. Following a campaign in which his own decisive opening strike against a considerably larger adversary force had produced a surrender so swift and so complete that the compact's military historians of the era had spent the following decade attempting to formally codify exactly what had made the victory possible. "You understand, strategist," Thurash said, during one of the several conversations the two of them shared across the fleet's approach to Meridian's outer system, "that I do not carry my family's legacy lightly into this campaign. Every Thurash for 6 generations has commanded at least one engagement in which the first 90 proved decisive. I do not intend to be the officer who breaks that inheritance, whatever species we happen to be testing it against this time." "I would not expect you to be, General," Corsa said, and he had meant it in that moment with the full, settled confidence of a scholar whose own life's work had never once encountered a counterexample significant enough to require serious reconsideration. "I have reviewed the intelligence assessment on this human colony's defensive capability. Modest fleet presence, technology roughly comparable to species we have previously encountered in the early stages of interstellar expansion. No indication of any doctrine sophisticated enough to meaningfully counter a properly executed opening strike." I would expect this engagement to confirm the pattern as thoroughly as any of the 600 that preceded it. Admiral Diane Kessler had commanded Earth's border defense fleet at Meridian's watch for 4 years by the time the Osirian compacts, survey drones, first registered in the system's outer sensor range. And she had spent every one of those 4 years, alongside a modest but exceptionally focused staff of intelligence analysts, preparing for exactly the kind of engagement Corsa's own scholarship had assured him was statistically inevitable the moment a compact fleet finally arrived to test it. Her own path to that command had run through a career considerably less linear than the scholarly trajectory that had carried Corsa to his own position aboard the Kel's Legacy. She had begun her military service in a considerably more modest capacity, as a junior logistics officer assigned to one of Earth's earliest deep space colonial support missions, a posting she had accepted, by her own later account, with no particular ambition beyond a stable career, and the chance to see something of the considerable distance her species' still young interstellar reach had begun to cover. It was during that early posting that she had witnessed, firsthand, the aftermath of an entirely different and considerably smaller crisis. A colonial supply convoy lost to a navigational hazard that a more thorough survey, conducted years earlier, would have flagged and avoided entirely. A loss that had cost 31 colonists their lives for want of preparation that had seemed, at the time the original survey was conducted, an unnecessary expense against a threat no one had believed genuinely likely to materialize. I learned something on that posting that I have carried with me through every subsequent command I have held, she told a group of visiting Offie Sirs some years after Meridian, during a training seminar conducted as part of the Joint Compact Human Military Exchange Program the peace treaty had eventually established. I learned that the cost of thorough preparation, however considerable it seems in the moment you're paying it, is almost always smaller than the cost of the disaster it prevents, and that the people who eventually have to explain why a preventable tragedy was not prevented rarely have a satisfying answer beyond some version of believing, at the time, that the threat was unlikely enough not to warrant the expense of guarding against it. I did not want to be the officer who gave that explanation if a compact fleet ever did arrive at Meridian's watch. I decided, from the earliest planning stages of our defensive doctrine, that I would rather spend 4 years and a considerable portion of our command's modest resources on a threat that might never materialize than risk explaining afterward why we hadn't. That conviction, carried forward across the full 3.5 years of the second-minute doctrine's development, had not been universally shared among Kessler's own superiors during the preparation period, and she would later acknowledge, in the same training seminar, that securing the resources and institutional patience required to sustain such an extended preparation effort against a threat whose actual arrival remained entirely speculative had required its own considerable, ongoing advocacy within Earth's broader colonial defense command structure. I do not tell you this to suggest the process was easy, or that every decision along the way was obviously correct in the moment it was made, she said. I tell you because I believe the willingness to prepare thoroughly against an uncertain future threat, even when that preparation carries real, immediate cost and no guarantee of ever being tested, is itself a discipline worth cultivating deliberately, rather than assuming it will simply arise naturally whenever the need eventually presents itself. By the time a threat is confirmed and imminent, the years required for genuinely thorough preparation are almost always already gone. The preparation had begun, as Kessler would later explain to the small circle of colleagues who eventually learned the full story, with a single captured data cache recovered from a derelict Assyrian scout vessel some 6 years earlier. A vessel that had suffered a catastrophic navigational failure deep within human-monitored space and had been recovered, largely intact, by a joint salvage operation conducted before the wider compact had any confirmed awareness that human territory existed at all. The cache had contained, among a considerable volume of routine technical and logistical data, a partial archive of compact military doctrine, including an early, somewhat abbreviated version of the same first 90 principle that Corsa had spent his own career refining into its more sophisticated modern formulation. The salvage itself had been led by a modest civilian recovery team operating under contract to Earth's Outer System Survey Administration, discovering the derelict vessel entirely by chance during a routine debris mapping operation in a sparsely charted region of space that no formal survey had previously flagged as containing anything of significance. The team's lead engineer, a careful, methodical woman named Priya Anantham, who had spent her career recovering derelict vessels of considerably more mundane origin, had recognized almost immediately, from the vessel's unfamiliar hull configuration and its equally unfamiliar internal architecture, that she had stumbled onto something considerably beyond the scope of her team's ordinary contract work, and she had, in a decision that would prove, in retrospect, among the most consequential of the entire pre-contact period, immediately flagged the discovery for the highest level of classified review Earth's still modest interstellar administration possessed. "I want to be honest about how uncertain this discovery originally seemed," Kessler told her senior staff, some 18 months into the preparation effort that would eventually define the whole of her command's defensive doctrine, standing before a modest gathering of officers assembled in Meridian's Watch's central command facility. The recovered data cache was damaged, incomplete, and written in a language our analysts spent the better part of a year successfully translating even in fragmentary form. We do not know with certainty whether the vessel's crew died in the original navigational failure or evacuated before its recovery, and we have no confirmed account of how thoroughly its doctrine documentation reflects the wider compact's current operational thinking, 6 years removed from whatever date the data itself was originally compiled. I want to be clear about something before this briefing goes any further. This captured doctrine is 6 years old, and it is incomplete. I do not believe we can assume the compact's actual operational doctrine matches this document in every particular, and I do not want anyone in this room treating our preparation as though we possess a complete, guaranteed picture of exactly what an eventual compact engagement will look like. What I do believe, based on the considerable consistency of the pattern this document describes, is that we are looking at an adversary whose entire military tradition has been built around the specific, narrow assumption that the opening 90 seconds of any engagement determines its eventual outcome. I believe that assumption has served them extraordinarily well against every species they have previously tested it against. I would like this command to become the first documented exception to that pattern, and I believe the only way we accomplish that is by building our entire defensive doctrine around precisely, deliberately surviving those first 90 seconds in a manner their own doctrine has never previously encountered. The doctrine that emerged from the following 3.5 years of careful, iterative preparation, refined across hundreds of simulated engagements conducted against every variation of compact tactical approach Kessler's staff could reasonably construct from the captured data's incomplete specifications, came to be known within Meridian's Watch's own command structure simply as the second minute, a deliberate, pointed reference to the specific window immediately following the compact's presumed decisive opening strike. The window Kessler's entire defensive philosophy was built to survive intact, and then, with considerable and precisely calculated force, answer. The path to that doctrine's final form had not been smooth, and Kessler's own staff would later recall, in interviews conducted during the post-war historical documentation effort, a specific simulation exercise conducted some 14 months into the preparation process that had very nearly convinced the command to abandon the second-minute approach entirely in favor of a considerably more conventional defensive posture. The exercise, designed by Kessler's chief tactical analyst, a careful, exacting officer named Commander Elias Wren, had modeled a compact opening strike calibrated to the upper bound of what the captured data suggested was possible, and the human fleet's carefully constructed defensive configuration had, in that particular simulation, suffered casualties considerably beyond what any subsequent iteration of the doctrine would ultimately require the actual engagement to sustain. I want to be honest with this command about what today's results suggest, Wren told the assembled staff, in a debrief that several officers present would later describe as among the most difficult of the entire preparation period. If the compact's actual opening strike capability matches the upper bound our simulation modeled today, our current defensive configuration does not survive it intact. I do not believe this means the second-minute concept is fundamentally flawed, but I do believe it means our current execution of that concept requires considerably more refinement than we have thus far achieved, and I am not confident we have identified the correct refinement yet. Kessler had not abandoned the doctrine in the face of that difficult result, a decision that several of her own staff would later credit as the single most consequential judgment call of the entire preparation period. Instead, she had ordered a complete reconstruction of the fleet's shield harmonic configuration, drawing on a body of theoretical materials science research that had, until that point, been considered largely impractical for military application due to its considerable power requirements that Meridian's Watch's own modest reactor capacity had needed nearly a full year of dedicated engineering work to accommodate. We are not going to outarmor a fleet that has spent 6 centuries perfecting the art of the opening strike, she told her staff, in the planning session that followed Wren's difficult report. We are going to outthink them, in the specific, narrow sense of building a defensive configuration precisely calibrated to the exact strike pattern their own doctrine specifies, rather than a generically robust defense capable of absorbing damage from any conceivable direction. Their doctrine's own predictability, the very consistency that has made it so effective across 600 prior engagements, is also its exploitable weakness if we are patient enough and precise enough to actually exploit it. The reconstructed configuration, tested across a further 18 months of increasingly refined simulation, eventually achieved exactly the survivability threshold Kessler's original doctrine had envisioned, a result that Wren himself, presenting the final validated simulation data some 3 years into the PR. Preparation effort would describe to the assembled command staff with a satisfaction he had not permitted himself to express during the difficult months of the doctrine's earlier, less certain development. Their doctrine assumes the first 90 seconds decide everything, Kessler explained to her staff, in the final formal briefing conducted before Meridian's Watch's sensor network confirmed the compact fleet's approach vector, some 3 years and 5 months after the doctrine's initial development had begun. I do not intend to contest that assumption directly, because I do not believe we can guarantee winning an opening exchange against a fleet this experienced, this well-drilled in executing exactly the kind of overwhelming first strike their entire tradition is built around. What I intend to do instead is make certain that surviving their opening strike, rather than being decided by it, becomes the actual determining factor in this engagement. Every ship in this fleet has been drilled repeatedly to absorb a first strike calibrated to their doctrine's own historical patterns, using defensive configurations specifically designed around exactly the kind of overwhelming opening volley their 600 prior campaigns have taught them to expect will end a conflict outright. And once that opening strike has been absorbed, without the collapse their doctrine assumes is inevitable, I want this fleet to answer it precisely and completely in the specific 90-second window immediately following, when their own doctrine offers them no established pattern for what happens next. Because in 600 years of documented military history, they have apparently never once needed to develop one. The compact fleet crossed into engagement range of Meridian's watch at 600 station time. 63 vessels arranged in the same confident, methodical formation that Corsa's own scholarship had documented across dozens of prior campaigns. And Grand Marshal Thurash gave the order for the opening strike with the settled, practiced calm of a commander, executing a maneuver his family's own military tradition had refined across 6 generations of unbroken success. Full opening volley, all vessels, precisely as drilled, Thurash said, standing at the command station of his flagship, the Kel's Legacy, named, as Corsa's own research had documented at length, in direct honor of the ancestor whose original insight had produced the doctrine now guiding every ship in the assembled fleet. I want this engagement decided within the 90 seconds our doctrine specifies, exactly as it has been decided across 600 prior campaigns. The opening volley, when it arrived, matched every specification Kessler's own preparation had anticipated with a precision that Corsa, watching from his own observation station aboard the Kel's Legacy, would later understand as the direct, measurable product of the same captured data that had informed the human commander's entire defensive doctrine. 63 vessels delivered a coordinated strike calibrated to overwhelm any conventional defensive configuration within the first critical seconds of contact. A demonstration of overwhelming, decisive force that had, across 600 documented prior engagements, never once failed to produce exactly the kind of psychological collapse the doctrine promised. Aboard Meridian's watch's own command deck, Kessler watched the same opening volley arrive against her fleet's carefully reconstructed shield harmonics with an attention that betrayed, to the small number of officers close enough to observe her directly, none of the considerable private uncertainty she carried into the engagement's opening seconds, despite 3.5 years of careful preparation. The volley struck with a force that registered across every sensor station on the bridge, at levels considerably beyond anything the fleet's crews had personally experienced even in their most rigorous simulation exercises. A distinction Wren would later note in his own after-action report as the specific, unavoidable gap between simulated data and the lived, visceral experience of actually absorbing an attack, calibrated to end a war in a single stroke. Shields holding across all vessels, Admiral, reported Kessler's own tactical officer, a young commander named Sophia Delacroix, whose voice, despite the considerable strain of the moment, carried the particular steadiness of an officer who had rehearsed this exact confirmation more times than she could easily count across the preceding years of preparation. Damage consistent with our modeled projections. No vessel has lost primary combat capability. Kessler allowed herself, in that specific instant, a single breath of something that was not quite relief, because relief implied a conclusion the engagement had not yet reached, but that carried, nonetheless, the particular weight of 3.5 years of preparation finally confirmed agains. The reality it had been built to survive. "Second minute, execute exactly as drilled," she said. "Target their formation's coordination nodes precisely as specified in the doctrine. We are not attempting to destroy this fleet, Commander. We are attempting to break the specific coordination architecture their entire subsequent engagement depends upon." "Report," Thurash said, his voice carrying, for the first time in Corsa's considerable experience serving alongside him, something that might genuinely have been described as confusion, a tone Corsa had never once heard from the Grand Marshal across the entirety of their prior acquaintance. "Human fleet has sustained the opening volley, General," reported the tactical officer, her own voice carrying a similar, uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Shield configurations show damage consistent with our strike's calculated force, but no vessels have been disabled or destroyed. Formation integrity remains fully intact across their entire fleet." Corsa felt something cold settle into his own chest, watching the tactical display, understanding in the specific, disorienting seconds that followed, that he was witnessing something his own considerable scholarship had never once prepared him to properly interpret. "General," he said, unable to fully suppress the alarm entering his own voice, "this does not match any documented pattern from the Doctrine's 600-year history. No adversary force has previously sustained a fully calibrated first 90 opening strike, without at minimum a 30% casualty rate among engaged vessels." "I am aware of the historical pattern, strategist," Thurash said, his own composure visibly straining under the weight of an outcome his family's own sixth-generation military tradition had never once required him to contemplate. "Continue the engagement exactly as drilled. Secondary strike, full coordination immediately." The secondary strike, delivered within the Doctrine's specified follow-up window, met a human fleet that had, in the intervening seconds, completed exactly the transition Kessler's own 3.5 years of preparation had been designed to produce, shifting from a purely defensive posture, calibrated to survive the compact's opening volley into a precisely coordinated counterstrike that Kessler herself, watching from Meridian's watch's own command deck, delivered with the calm, unhurried authority of a commander executing a maneuver her own staff had rehearsed hundreds of times across 3.5 years of careful, iterative simulation. "All batteries execute the second minute precisely as drilled," Kessler said. "Target their formation's coordination nodes first, exactly as specified. We are not attempting to destroy this fleet outright. We are attempting to break the specific coordination their doctrine depends on for any sustained engagement beyond the opening exchange." The human counterstrike landed with a precision that Corsa, watching from the Kells Legacy's own observation station, understood, even in the raw confusion of the unfolding engagement, as the product of preparation every bit as extensive and every bit as carefully calibrated as the doctrine his own fleet had spent 6 centuries refining. 12 compact vessels lost primary coordination systems within the first 15 seconds of the human counterstrike, a disabling blow that Kessler's own staff had specifically designed to target not the fleet's raw offensive capability, but the precise, interconnected coordination architecture that the first 90 doctrines' entire subsequent execution depended upon. Commander Delacroix, executing the coordinated targeting sequence from her own station on Meridian's Watch's bridge, felt the particular, focused clarity of 3.5 years of drilling finally arriving at its intended purpose, calling out confirmation after confirmation, as successive compact vessels registered the loss of synchronized targeting capability across her own tactical display. 12 vessels confirmed disabled at coordination level, Admiral, she reported, her voice carrying a controlled intensity that Kessler recognized, even amid the engagement's continuing tension, as the specific sound of a doctrine finally proving itself against the reality it had been built to answer. Remaining fleet elements showing signs of degraded synchronized targeting. Recommend we hold position and allow the disruption to compound rather than pressing the advantage further at this stage. Agreed, Kessler said. Full defensive posture, all vessels. We have accomplished what this engagement required of us. I do not want to provoke a full-scale escalation this fleet did not come here seeking, once their coordination advantage has already been sufficiently disrupted. Formation coordination failing across 12 vessels, General, the tactical officer aboard the Kells Legacy reported, her voice climbing toward genuine alarm as successive. Damage reports continued arriving across the fleet's full formation. We are losing synchronized targeting capability across the affected vessels. Remaining fleet elements are receiving conflicting coordination data. Thurash stood at his command station, watching the tactical displays steadily accumulating confirmation of an outcome his own family's sixth-generation military tradition had never once required him to contemplate. And Corsa, watching the Grand Marshal in that specific, disorienting moment, understood that he was witnessing something considerably more significant than a single engagement's tactical reversal. He was witnessing, in real time, the specific instant at which 600 years of unbroken compact military doctrine finally, catastrophically met an adversary who had studied it closely enough and prepared against it thoroughly enough to turn its own foundational assumption into the precise instrument of its undoing. The doctrine specifies withdrawal is not a viable option once the first 90 window has closed, Thurash said, his voice carrying a quality Corsa had never previously heard from him, something considerably closer to the specific, private uncertainty of a man watching his entire inherited understanding of warfare collapse in real time before his own eyes. Continue the engagement. Full fleet commitment, exactly as the doctrine specifies for a contested opening exchange. General, Corsa said, and he understood, even as he spoke, that he was crossing a line his own institutional position had never previously required him to cross, offering tactical counsel rather than simply documenting the campaign's historical significance. I would ask you to consider that the doctrine's specification for a contested opening exchange was developed across 600 engagements in which the contest itself was decided within the specified window, one way or another. We are not currently in a contested opening exchange, General. We are in an engagement whose fundamental pattern the doctrine has never previously encountered, and I do not believe the doctrine's prescribed response to a scenario it has never once needed to address should be trusted as reliably as its response to the scenarios it was actually built from. Thurash was quiet for a long moment, his attention divided between the tactical display's steadily worsening confirmation of the human counterstrike's effectiveness and the specific, uncomfortable weight of Corsa's observation. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular, difficult quality of a commander confronting, for the first time in his considerable career, a decision his own inherited doctrine offered him no genuine guidance for making. Full withdrawal, Thurash said finally, the order arriving with an evident cost that Corsa understood, even in the chaos of the ongoing engagement, represented a genuine and consequential break from 6 generations of unbroken family tradition. All vessels, immediate withdrawal beyond engagement range. I will not commit this fleet further into an engagement pattern our own doctrine has never once prepared us to navigate. The withdrawal, executed across the following 11 minutes under continuing, though considerably reduced, pressure from Kessler's own fleet, which had been specifically instructed not to pursue beyond the immediate tactical advantage the coordination strike had already secured, concluded with the compact fleet's full 63 vessels intact but severely disorganized, 12 of them still struggling to restore full coordination capability. And the entirety of Grand Marshal Thurash's command staff, according to Corsa's own subsequent record of the engagement, in a state of genuine, unprecedented institutional shock. I want the full engagement record compiled and transmitted to Compact War Command immediately, Thurash said, once the withdrawal had cleared Meridian's watch's effective engagement range, and the fleet's own damage assessment had confirmed the full scope of what had occurred. I do not believe I am the appropriate officer to determine what this engagement means for the broader campaign, strategist. I believe that determination belongs to considerably more senior authority than my own command, and I believe it deserves to be made with the full, unedited record of exactly what happened here, rather than any account I might construct to soften the specific, considerable weight of what my own doctrine has just failed to survive. The formal review that followed occupied the better part of 4 months, conducted at the Compact's own senior war college, the same institution where Corsa had spent over a decade lecturing on the very doctrine now under the most serious institutional scrutiny it had faced across the whole of its 6th-century history. Corsa himself was called to testify on 11 separate occasions, testimony that required him, across the considerable length of the review, to confront the specific, uncomfortable gap between his own published scholarship's confident certainty and the disorienting reality he had personally witnessed aboard the Kells Legacy. "Strategist Corsa," said Senior War Counselor Meshin Tavril, the review's presiding officer, during Corsa's 4th appearance before the formal proceedings. "You have published, by my own count, 2 full volumes and 11 separate papers establishing the first 90 as a reliable, near-universal predictor of engagement, outcomes across the whole of documented compact military history. I would like to understand, in your own scholarly assessment, whether the Meridian engagement represents a genuine exception to that pattern, or whether it suggests some more fundamental flaw in the doctrine's underlying theoretical foundation." Corsa had considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that his response would carry consequences for the whole of his own subsequent scholarly reputation, whatever direction he chose to take it. "Counselor," he said finally, "I have spent the 4 months since the Meridian engagement conducting the most rigorous re-examination of my own prior scholarship that I have undertaken across the entirety of my career, and I believe I have arrived at an answer that is considerably more uncomfortable than either a simple exception or a simple theoretical flaw. I believe the first 90 doctrine accurately describes what happens when a technologically comparable adversary encounters our fleet's opening strike without any specific advance preparation against it. I believe, based on the considerable evidence recovered from Meridian's watch's own command records following our formal peace negotiations, that the human defensive doctrine was built specifically, deliberately, and over a period of more than 3 years, around a captured fragment of our own military doctrine, recovered from a derelict scout vessel some 6 years prior to the engagement. I do not believe this suggests the first 90 is theoretically unsound, counselor. I believe it suggests something considerably more unsettling, that a doctrine's effectiveness depends entirely on an adversary's ignorance of its specific mechanics, and that any sufficiently patient, sufficiently thorough adversary, given adequate warning and adequate preparation time, can construct a specific counter to its execution, regardless of how many centuries of prior success that execution has previously demonstrated. The chamber had been quiet for a long moment following that testimony, and Corsa understood, watching the careful, considering expressions of the assembled council, that he had just articulated a conclusion that carried implications considerably beyond the specific tactical question the review had originally been convened to address. Not every member of the council received that conclusion with the same open consideration Tavril had shown. Councillor Baresh Andral, a considerably more senior member of the body whose own career had been built, in no small part, on decades of confident public advocacy for the first 90's continued centrality to compact military planning, pressed Corsa with a line of questioning that carried, beneath its formal courtesy, a clear resistance to the broader institutional critique his testimony had begun to suggest. "Strategist Corsa," Andral said, "I want to be direct with you about a concern this testimony raises for me. You are proposing before this council that 6 centuries of validated military doctrine should be fundamentally reclassified on the strength of a single engagement, conducted against a single adversary, under circumstances that you yourself acknowledge involved considerable specific advance preparation on that adversary's part. I would ask you to consider whether a single counterexample, however costly, genuinely warrants the scale of institutional revision your testimony appears to be recommending, or whether it warrants instead a more modest, targeted adjustment specific to adversaries who can be confirmed to possess comparable advance intelligence." Corsa had considered his answer carefully before offering it, understanding that Andral's skepticism, however unwelcome, touched a genuine and legitimate methodological question his own scholarly training obligated him to address honestly rather than dismiss. "Counselor," he said finally, "I want to acknowledge directly that a single engagement is, in the strictest statistical sense, a modest sample from which to revise 6 centuries of accumulated data. I do not believe the Meridian engagement alone would justify the scale of reform I have recommended if it stood entirely in isolation. But I would ask this council to consider that the engagement's significance lies not merely in its outcome, but in the specific mechanism by which that outcome was achieved. The human fleet did not defeat our doctrine through superior raw technology, nor rough some fortunate tactical accident our own analysis cannot explain. They defeated it through patient, systematic study of our own methodology, applied with a rigor that any sufficiently motivated future adversary could, in principle, replicate. I do not believe this council can responsibly treat that vulnerability as an isolated anomaly, counselor, precisely because the mechanism that produced it, careful study followed by precise counter-preparation, is not unique to this particular human commander. It is available, in principle, to any adversary patient enough and resourced enough to pursue it. And I believe our doctrine's continued reliability depends on our willingness to account for that vulnerability now, rather than waiting for a second, third, or 10th confirmation at proportionally greater cost. Andral had been quiet for a long moment following that answer, And though the formal record would never indicate whether Corsa's response had genuinely shifted the senior counselor's position, the reforms that eventually emerged from the council's deliberations passed with a majority considerably larger than the narrow margin some observers had initially predicted, suggested that the specific, careful distinction Corsa had drawn between isolated anomaly and demonstrated structural vulnerability had carried weight beyond what a single engagement's raw outcome, however dramatic, could have achieved alone. The reforms that eventually emerged from the Council's extended review were, by the standards of the Compact's own historically confident, doctrine-bound institutional culture, remarkably comprehensive, requiring, among a considerable range of other changes, a fundamental reassessment of the first 90s status from an assumed universal principle to a documented historical tendency, requiring active verification against any adversary whose intelligence and preparation capability could not be confidently ruled out in advance. Corsa himself was appointed to lead the Reform Commission's research division, a position he held for the remainder of his formal career, revising his own prior scholarship across a series of new publications that would eventually become, within the Compact's reformed War College curriculum, considerably more influential than his original work had ever been. Grand Marshal Thurash, for his part, was not removed from active command, a decision the Council's own formal ruling attributed directly to the specific, difficult honesty of his own campaign report, submitted in full and without any attempt to minimize the scope of his own doctrinal failure, and to the disciplined, ultimately correct judgment he had exercised in ordering the withdrawal once Corsa's own council had made clear that the doctrine's prescribed response no longer applied to the specific pattern the engagement had revealed. "I want to understand something general," Corsa said, some months after the review's conclusion, during a quiet conversation the two of them shared in the considerably more modest circumstances of Thurash's subsequent posting. A training command far removed from the frontier campaigns that had once defined his family's sixth-generation military legacy. "You broke a tradition your own ancestor established, in the specific moment that tradition's continuation would have cost this fleet considerably more than the engagement had already claimed. I would like to understand what allowed you to make that decision, in the specific seconds it required, against the full weight of everything your family's legacy had prepared you to do instead." Thurash considered the question for a long moment, his attention on some point beyond the modest training facility's viewport, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a weight Corsa had not heard from him even in the immediate, raw aftermath of the original engagement. "I think about my ancestor often, strategist," he said. "I think about the specific courage it must have required him to articulate a genuinely new principle 600 years ago, rather than simply continuing to fight according to whatever doctrine had preceded his own innovation. I have come to believe, across the months since Meridian, that the truest honor I could offer his legacy was never simply continuing to execute his doctrine unchanged, generation after generation, regardless of whether it still matched the adversaries we encountered. I believe the truest honor was recognizing, in the specific moment his doctrine finally met its limit, that he would have wanted his descendants to possess the same clear-eyed willingness to adapt that had allowed him to develop the first 90 in the first place, rather than clinging to his original formulation simply because it carried his name and 6 centuries of accumulated institutional reverence. I have read your family's private archives in the course of my own subsequent research," Corsa said, "with your permission granted through the Council's formal historical review. I found something in your ancestor's own private correspondence that I do not believe has previously been published in any account of his life, and I would like to share it with you if you have not already encountered it yourself. I have not, Thurash said, please. He wrote in a letter to his own son some years after the campaign that first produced the Doctrine that he did not wish to be remembered as a man who had discovered an eternal truth about warfare, because he did not believe such a truth existed. He wrote that he had discovered, instead, a specific pattern that happened to hold across the specific adversaries and specific circumstances of his own era, and he expressed, in language I found considerably more humble than the 6 centuries of institutional reverence that followed him ever quite preserved, a hope that his descendants would possess the wisdom to recognize when that pattern had finally, inevitably, stopped holding. Rather than mistaking his own specific insight for a permanent law that no future circumstance could ever overturn. Thurash was quiet for a long moment following that account, and when he finally spoke, something in his voice carried a complicated mixture of grief and a fierce, protective pride that Corsa understood as the particular shape reverence for an ancestor sometimes took when it finally, fully reckoned with the specific human limits of what that ancestor had actually intended to leave behind. I wish I had known that before Meridian, he said finally. I wish this entire compact had known it, rather than allowing 6 centuries of institutional certainty to transform a specific, humble insight into something considerably closer to an article of unquestioned faith. I do not believe my ancestor would have wanted that transformation, strategist, whatever the considerable military success it produced across the centuries that followed him. Commander Elias Wren, who had led the specific tactical analysis that ultimately produced the second minute's final, successful configuration, found himself, in the years following the engagement, invited to participate in the joint compact human-military exchange program that emerged from the peace treaty's broader provisions, a posting that required him to spend considerable time working directly alongside compact tactical officers whose own careers had, until Meridian, been built entirely within the doctrinal certainty his own preparation had helped dismantle. He met, during one such exchange session, a young compact tactical officer named Sarath Volin, barely 2 years into her own military service at the time of the engagement, who had served aboard one of the 12 vessels whose coordination systems the human counterstrike had disabled. She approached him during a break in the formal exchange proceedings with a directness that Wren, still adjusting to the particular conversational conventions of compact military culture, found himself genuinely appreciating. I want to ask you something, Commander, she said, that I have not had the opportunity to ask anyone who actually designed the doctrine that disabled my own ship systems. I was 2 years into my service when the coordination failure hit our vessel. I remember the specific, disorienting confusion of watching every targeting solution I had trained to execute simply stop functioning, within seconds, with no warning our own doctrine had prepared me to expect. I would like to understand, honestly, whether you designed that specific vulnerability knowing it would produce exactly that experience, or whether the human psychological impact was simply an incidental byproduct of a purely technical targeting decision. Wren considered the question carefully before answering, understanding that his response carried weight for a young officer still processing an experience that had, by her own account, shaped the entirety of her subsequent military thinking. I want to be honest with you, Lieutenant, he said. We designed the targeting priority around coordination nodes because Admiral Kessler's own analysis, identified that architecture as your fleet's single most exploitable structural dependency, not primarily because we anticipated the specific psychological experience it would produce for individual officers aboard the affected vessels. But I would be less than honest if I told you we gave no thought at all to that psychological dimension. Admiral Kessler understood from the earliest planning stages that your Doctrine's psychological model assumed the opening 90 seconds would determine everyone's understanding of the conflict's eventual outcome. She believed, and I came to share her belief across the years of preparation that followed, that the most effective counter to that psychological model was not simply surviving it, but replacing it, in that same critical window, with a new and equally vivid demonstration that your own do. Trine's central certainty no longer applied. I do not believe we designed your own personal confusion and disorientation as an end in itself, Lieutenant. But I will not pretend we were indifferent to the fact that producing exactly that kind of disorientation in the specific officers whose confidence your doctrine depended upon was central to what the engagement needed to accomplish. Volan had been quiet for a long moment following that answer, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something that Wren understood, even across the considerable cultural distance still separating their two peoples' military traditions, as a genuine and hard-won respect. "I appreciate the honesty, Commander," she said. "I have spent considerable time, in the years since Meridian, trying to understand what happened to me in those specific seconds, and I believe your answer helps me understand it more completely than any of the formal reviews or academic papers I have read on the subject. I do not believe I hold any particular resentment toward you personally for designing the system that produced that confusion. I have come to believe, instead, that I am grateful for it, in a considerably more complicated way than I expected to feel when I first requested this conversation. I do not believe I would have developed the specific caution and adaptability that has since defined my own subsequent career, Commander, without first experiencing, directly and personally, exactly how completely an unquestioned certainty can collapse when it finally meets an adversary who has studied it closely enough to answer it. The exchange program that produced that conversation, and the considerable number of similar exchanges conducted across the years that followed, would eventually become, in Corsa's own later assessment as the Reform Commission's research director, one of the treaty's most consequential and least publicly celebrated achievements. Not the formal terms of the agreement itself, considerable as those terms proved in reshaping the broader relationship between the two governments, but the slow, patient, individual work of officers like Wren and Volan, meeting across the specific, personal wreckage of an engagement that had shaped both their careers, and finding, in the careful honesty of conversations neither government had specifically mandated, something considerably closer to genuine mutual understanding than any formal diplomatic process alone could have produced. The peace negotiations that followed the Meridian engagement, conducted over the course of several months between compact diplomatic representatives and a human delegation led personally by Admiral Kessler herself, produced a formal treaty considerably more equal in its terms than any prior agreement the compact had negotiated across the whole of its 6th-century expansion. A fact that Corsa, attending the formal signing in his own new capacity as the Reform Commission's research director, understood as its own quiet, considerable testament to exactly how thoroughly the Meridian engagement had reshaped the compact's broader institutional posture. The negotiations themselves had not proceeded without their own considerable difficulty, particularly in the early sessions, during which the compact's initial delegation, still operating under instructions drafted before the full scope of the War Council's institutional reckoning had been formally adopted, had attempted to frame the engagement's outcome as a modest tactical anomaly rather than the fundamental doctrinal challenge Corsa's own testimony had helped establish before the formal review. Kessler, according to the detailed account she would later provide to the Joint Historical Documentation Project, had responded to that initial framing with a patience that surprised several members of her own delegation, declining to press the tactical advantage her fleet's success had secured and instead redirecting the conversation, repeatedly and consistently, toward the specific terms of a durable, genuinely equal partnership, rather than any punitive concession extracted from a temporarily disadvantaged adversary. "I do not want a treaty built on your government's embarrassment, Ambassador," she told the Compact's senior negotiator, a careful, formal diplomat named Vessel Cranth, during a private session conducted midway through the negotiations' second month. "I want a treaty built on the specific, durable recognition that our two peoples are going to be neighbors in this region of space for a very long time, and that the terms we establish now will shape whether that neighborhood is defined by mutual respect or by a resentment your government will eventually feel compelled to address through some future conflict neither of us wants to fight. I would ask your delegation to consider the negotiations in those terms, rather than as a formal accounting of who currently holds the tactical advantage." Cranth had carried that, framing back to his own government's senior leadership, a decision that Corsa, reviewing the negotiations' full documentary record some years later, would come to understand as the specific turning point that transformed the talks from a cautious, defensive exercise in damage limitation into the genuinely collaborative process that ultimately produced the treaty's final, considerably more equal terms. Corsa himself, attending the formal signing in his own new capacity as the Reform Commission's research director, found a quiet moment alongside Kessler during the ceremony's considerably less formal reception. "I want to ask you something, Admiral," he said, "that I have turned over in my thinking many times across the months since our fleet's withdrawal. You built your entire defensive doctrine around a document recovered from a single derelict scout vessel, incomplete and 6 years out of date by the time your fleet finally tested it. I would like to understand how you arrived at the confidence required to commit 3.5 years of your command's resources to a doctrine built on such a narrow, uncertain foundation." Kessler considered the question for a long moment before she answered, her attention on the considerable gathering of both compact and human representatives now sharing the reception's modest hospitality with a cautious, still developing ease that neither delegation had possessed at the negotiations' outset. "I did not build my confidence on the document's completeness, strategist," she said finally. "I built it on a considerably simpler observation, one that I believe your own subsequent research has since confirmed in its own particular way. Any doctrine built and refined across 6 centuries of consistent success eventually stops being questioned by the people who execute it, because questioning it has never once been necessary. I did not need to fully understand every detail of your fleet's military tradition to build an effective counter to it, strategist. I needed only to understand that your tradition's very success had made it rigid in a manner mine could not afford to be, precisely because we possessed no comparable history of unbroken victory to protect. We built our doctrine assuming we would need to adapt it repeatedly against an adversary whose own doctrine, however imperfectly we understood its specifics, would almost certainly prove less flexible than our own necessity required us to become." Corsa carried that answer with him for the remainder of his career, understanding it, across the considerable years of reform and reflection that followed, as the precise, uncomfortable insight his own 600 documented engagements had never once required him to fully confront. That certainty, however thoroughly earned across however many centuries of consistent validation, carried within it its own particular vulnerability, and that the doctrine which had built the whole of the Compact's considerable military tradition had finally, in a single 90-second window above a modest human border colony, met an adversary who understood, with a clarity 6 centuries of unbroken success had never once required the Compact itself to develop. That the surest way to defeat an unbreakable tradition was never to overpower it directly, but to study it closely enough and prepare against it patiently enough, that its own celebrated certainty became the precise instrument of its undoing. He returned to Meridian's watch himself, some 11 years after the original engagement, invited by the Joint Historical Commission overseeing the treaty's ongoing implementation to participate in a formal retrospective marking the anniversary of the peace agreement's signing. He found the modest border colony transformed, in the intervening years, into something considerably more substantial than the outpost his own fleet had once approached with such settled, catastrophically misplaced confidence. Its population grown, its trade connections expanded across a network that now included regular commercial and cultural exchange with the very compact worlds whose fleets had once come to conquer it. Admiral Kessler, by then retired from active command, but still active within the joint military exchange program that had grown from her own initial peace negotiations, met him at the colony's modest memorial garden, established some years earlier at the specific initiative of a joint Compact Human Veterans Committee, its careful plantings and quiet, contemplative pathways honoring, in equal and deliberately balanced measure, the crew members lost on both sides of the original engagement. I did not expect, 11 years ago, that we would ever stand together in a garden built to honor both our fleets equally, Corsa said, studying the careful, deliberate balance of the memorial's design. Human and compact commemorative markers arranged side by side without any hierarchy of prominence between them. Neither did I, Hun. Estley, Kessler said. I built my doctrine to survive an attack, strategist, not to eventually stand beside the officer who ordered it, discussing a garden neither of our governments could have imagined building on the morning your fleet first crossed into our engagement range. I have come to believe, across the years since, that this garden represents something considerably more significant than either of our formal treaties, however important those treaties genuinely proved. It represents the specific, hard-won recognition, on both sides, that the morning our doctrines collided did not have to determine everything that followed it. However completely, it determined the outcome of that single, decisive 90-second window. Corsa thought about that observation for a long time afterward, walking the memorial garden's quiet pathways in the particular, reflective solitude of a scholar whose entire career had been reshaped by a single morning's engagement. And he understood, finally, standing before the garden's carefully balanced memorial markers, that the truest legacy of the doctrine that had broken above Meridian's watch was never simply the specific tactical reform it eventually produced, nor even the considerable diplomatic achievement of the peace that followed it, but something smaller and considerably harder to formalize into any academic paper, however carefully constructed. It was the specific, permanent understanding, carried forward by everyone the engagement had touched, that even 6 centuries of unbroken certainty could meet its limit in a single 90-second window, and that the measure of a genuinely capable people, whether compact or human, was never simply how completely they had once succeeded, but how honestly they were willing to reckon with the specific morning that success finally, inevitably met an adversary patient enough and humble enough and prepared enough to prove that no doctrine, however venerable, however thoroughly proven across however many centuries of consistent validation, was ever truly beyond the reach of a mind willing to study it closely enough to answer it.